We are proud and privileged to co-sponsor this conference with our Center for Israel Studies. It's always an extraordinary pleasure for me to work with my colleague Michael Brenner and with the inestimable Laura Cutler. What I'd like to do is very briefly introduce our panelists. You have their full biographies, and so I'm just going to make very brief introductions, and then we will hear from them so that we have the maximum amount of time for questions and answers. Eli Rekes is one of Israel's leading experts on the political history of Israel's Arab minority, Jewish-Arab relations, and the Islamic resurgence in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. The Crown Visiting Professor of Israel Studies, he is Associate Director of the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies at Northwestern University. His books include Muslim Minorities in Non-Muslim Majority Countries, The Islamic Movement in Israel as a Test Case, and The Arab Society in Israel, a Compendium. And he will speak today about the Arabs in Israel shifting national and civic identities. David Myers is the Sadie, I hope I pronounced that correctly, and Ludwig Professor of Jewish History at UCLA, where he is also the past chair of the Department of History. Some of you may recognize him from his teaching for the Wexner Heritage Foundation. The author or editor of 11 books. They include Resisting History, Historicism and Its Discontents in German Jewish Thought, and Between Jew and Arab, The Lost Voice of Shimon Ravidovich. He will speak today about a tale of two sovereigns, Haredi culture in Israel and the United States. Tudor Parfit is Distinguished Professor and President Navon Professor of Sephardi and Mizrahi Studies at Florida International University, and he is also Professor Emeritus at SOAS University, whose full title, I believe, is SOAS University of London. Is that correct? Among his 26 books and 7 documentaries are Black Jews in Africa and the Americas, and Memory and Ethnicity, Ethnic Museums in Israel and the Diaspora. His topic for this afternoon for our session, Religion and Ethnicity, is Beyond Sambation, what will the worldwide explosion of new Israelite communities and Judaizing movements mean for the Jewish state? And we will start with Professor Rekes.
Thank you, Pam. I'd like first to thank the organizers, Michael, and the indefatigable, I hope I pronounce it correctly, Laura, for all your efforts, really. So originally, I was planning to talk about the major processes of change and transition pertaining to national and civic identities of the Arab Palestinians in Israel. However, due to the recent developments, the wave of violence in Israel over Temple Mount, and the prominent role played by Israeli Arabs in it, I decided to shift the focus of my presentation. A methodological remark, I will be using Israeli Arabs, Arab Palestinian in Israel, Palestinian Arabs in Israel, Arab minority interchangeably, just for reasons of convenience, no political interpretation to that. So what happened? In Beersheba, Afula, Gan Shmuel, there have been deadly attacks by Israeli Arabs on fellow Israeli citizens, use of arms, stabbing, confrontations between Arab protesters and security forces occurred in Jewish Arab towns like Jaffa, in al-Fahim, not a Jewish Arab town, Nazareth, and elsewhere. Wide-scale demonstrations were held in Arab towns, the biggest in Sakhnin, which drew some 25,000 protesters. Arab Knesset members vociferously came out in defense of Al-Aqsa, harshly condemning Israeli politics, threatening to provocatively visit Temple Mount. The Islamic movement repeatedly chanted its popular and charged slogan, Al-Aqsa fi Khatar, Al-Aqsa is in danger. Jewish-Arab relations in Israel deteriorated swiftly. The Jewish public reacted with fear and outrage. Jewish consumer responded by boycotting Arab shops, restaurants, towns, and villages. The sights of the last weeks were reminiscent of the October 2000 riots at the beginning of the Second Intifada. So what I want to do in light of this event is to try and connect between the question of identity of the Arab Palestinians in Israel and their conspicuous involvement in the present crisis. I will examine the recent events through three prisms, or conceptual framework of reference, which are oftentimes used by scholars to describe, admittedly in a rather simplistic manner, the processes of transformation in the political outlook of the Arabs in Israel, namely Israelization, Palestinization, and Islamization. Academics like zations. So what happened on the Israelization sphere? Israelization is typically referred to as representing a civic aspect of the identity of the Arab minority in Israel, oftentimes defined and measured by the degree of integration of the Arab sector in Israeli society, socially, economically, and politically. So on the economic level, what we see are lights and shadows. There are good news and bad news. In recent years, the Arab sector has undergone considerable socio-economic change for the better. One can identify an emergent middle class, well entrenched into the Israeli reality. The government has significantly increased its investments in the Arab sector. More budgets earmarked for education, public transportation, employment. There is an authority for the economic development of the Arab sector headed by Ayman Saif that has addressed numerous acute issues. Some, I'll quote Ron Gerlitz, the director of Sikui, an NGO that monitors government's activities, would go as far as considering the situation as, quote unquote, the end of the denial era, denial by the government. And furthermore, just recently in August 2015, Netanyahu met with the four leaders of the joint list and promised to add almost 1 billion shekel. Well, he promised. Doesn't mean that the money will necessarily be transferred, but this is a good start to the budget for the Arab sector. There was a team named 121st Days, headed by Ilan Levy of the Finance Ministry. They prepared a report, which was published in June, with recommendation on how to remove construction and planning barriers in the Arab sector, including for the first time allocation of land for development. So these were the good news. The bad news, despite the substantial government efforts, vast socioeconomic disparities continue to exist and to separate Jews from Arabs. Calvin spoke about some of the differences, but let me just briefly mention additional one. Gaps in the average monthly income between Jews and Arabs, percentage under poverty line, much higher in the Arab sector, problems of employment. The figures are there, but I don't want to waste my time on that. Housing, industrialization, and more. Yes, there are deep-seated structural obstacles which pertain to the Arab sector itself, obstacles which obstruct delay and development. There are geographical dispersal, distance from employment center, poor public transportation, lack of daycare centers, underutilization of budgets by local council. However, the younger generation is not impressed. The younger generation is disenchanted, restless, impatient, perhaps resonating the spirit of the so-called Arab Spring. In a somewhat similar pattern to the October 2000 riots, there is pent-up anger over the slow pace of the economic integration process, the widening gaps, and the ongoing deprivation. So my first interim conclusion is that the present response of the Israeli Arabs over the Temple Mount crisis undoubtedly reflects cumulative frustration over unresolved socioeconomic disparities. It dramatically illustrates the fragility of the economic paradigm or the economic integration model, and definitely from an Arab perspective, but from a Jewish perspective as well, as we will see. Still, under Israelization, let me say a few words about the political arena. I cannot but refer to the 2015 Knesset elections and their impact. So, as an introduction, I would say that Arabs were formally integrated into the political system from 1949. They have voted, they have been elected. However, in practical terms, Arab parties were and are traditionally excluded from government coalitions. Now, the 2015 situation heralded a potential change. Four Arab parties achieved the almost unattainable goal of uniting under one flag against all odds. The turnout of the Arab voters went up. The joint list won 13 Knesset members, and the importance of parliamentary elections and Arab presence in the Knesset became relevant again. However, today, 7 months after elections, the hopes for change evaporated. The joint list remains outside the scope of the decision-making process in Israel. The blatant political exclusion is interpreted again as a continuous Israeli-Jewish effort to delegitimize the Arab public and disqualify the Arab voters. Bibi's call urging Jewish voters to rush to the ballots because Arabs are rushing to the ballots became embedded in the collective memory. So another interim conclusion would be that the recent wave of protests reflects the Arab disenchantment with the parliamentary political system and the Arab Knesset members' personal frustration. Linked to that is the shift in to the right in the Israeli political scene. What we've seen in the last 10, 15 years are several worrying phenomena: growing Jewish animosity towards Arab, open hostility bordering at times with racism, price tag acts, public opinion coming up with horrible, disturbing findings. The rise of Lieberman, Israel Shelanu, contributed to the anti-Arab atmosphere. His election slogan, "No citizenship without loyalty," the plan of land and population swap, etc. Furthermore, also the anti-Arab initiatives on the legislative level, we should add that, the Loyalty Oath Bill, the Communities Bill, and most recently, Basic Law, Jewish Nation of Israel of May 2013, with the intention to ensure Israel's Jewish identity, reserving the right for self-determination in Israel to Jews only. Well, it did not pass. The last time it was delayed, I think it was in 2014. So this is as far as the Israelization circle is concerned. Let me now move to the second sphere, Palestinization. Here I'm on a safer ground, I should say. And what happened in the Arab sector in the last couple of weeks is the strongest manifestation of the Palestinization process, which dates back to 1967. I had the dubious honor of being part of those who coined the term Palestinization. So for me, what happened in recent weeks is, as I said, the strongest manifestation. What happened in 67, very briefly, the Six-Day War reunified the Arabs who remained in Israel after 48 with their Palestinian brethren, from whom they were physically detached for 19 years. This led to the reconstruction of their Palestinian roots, solidification of the Palestinian component in their national identity, adoption of a Palestinian national platform, and a strengthening affinity to the PLO. There were more developments in recent years, but I will not go into that now. We can therefore conclude, as another interim conclusion, that this recent wave illustrates the unmistakable national identification of the Arab Palestinian minority with the fate and the destiny of the Palestinian people and their struggle for self-determination in the West Bank and Gaza. The already complex identity crisis of the Arabs in Israel has been drastically sharpened. And we observe the pattern. The commitment to the Palestinian national cause is reaffirmed each time a threat on the national or religious Palestinian symbol rise. Again, the situation is similar to October 2000. However, there are some major differences between the two periods. I think that the lessons of October 2000 have been studied, drawn, and learned by both Jews and Arabs. Unlike October 2000, Israeli Arabs this time were not fully drawn into the cycle of violence. Occasional lethal attacks by individual, yes. Identification, yes. But no open call to enroll in the violent cycle. Most of the political leadership, and I'll get to the Islamic movement in a minute, demonstrated responsibility and political maturity, I would say. Concurrently, on the Israeli Jewish side, the police was much more cautious, or is much more cautious and restrained till now. So since time is running, and I'm seeing the chairperson looking at me, not only because she's enchanted by well, I'm glad that there is a light. I'm sorry? What I'm saying is not true? No, I'm good. I needed a break. It's okay. Actually, while we were at the break, I had I was speaking about good news and bad news. Remember, like 7 pages ago. So I always tell this anecdote about President Yeltsin. Remember Yeltsin, Russian president, who had a lot of medical problems of different kinds. So once in a press conference, he was asked, "Mr. President, how do you feel?" So he said, "In one word, good. In 2 words, not good." So now we're moving to the third circle, Islamization. So some background. Since the early 1970s, the Muslim community in Israel has been undergoing an intensified process of Islamic revival. Influenced by the doctrines of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Islamic movement in Israel promoted Islam not only as a set of beliefs between the individual and the Almighty, but also, and not less importantly, as the ideal social and cultural, and to some extent political framework for the Muslim society in Israel. And as I said, following the pattern of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Islamic movement in Israel was particularly successful in mobilizing the Muslim population for Islamic-oriented community work. It deployed an impressive network of societal institutions ranging from preschool daycares and welfare organizations to sport teams and drug rehabilitation centers. The formula of promoting socioeconomic issues under the banner of Islam worked well. The Arab community in Israel became increasingly Islamicized. The Islamic leadership gradually became more assertive, if not aggressive, in its drive to impose the rigid Islamic norm on the local population. Let me just give 2 brief examples from the last couple of months. In July 2015, the municipality of Tira in the Triangle area in central Israel was fiercely attacked by the Islamists for organizing a mixed males and females folk dance event on Ramadan and was forced to cancel it. In the same Tira, Hanin Radi, a local female runner, organized a mini marathon for girls. Next day, her car was shot. Now, I should add that events of this kind generated angry opposition by the liberal secular younger generation and a dynamic exchange on the social media. So back to the Islamic movement political agenda. On the political national level, the movement accomplished great achievement by turning Islamic symbols, first and foremost Al-Aqsa, into an icon of religious solidarity. Under the charismatic leadership of Sheikh Ra'ed Salah, head of the northern faction of the Islamic movement, the more dogmatic faction, it has been running an annual campaign for years now. In defense of the Islamic holy sites on Temple Mount, it succeeded in inserting the sense of imminent danger to Al-Aqsa under the slogan, Al-Aqsa fi khatar, Al-Aqsa is in danger. So thus, the Islamic movement has blurred the line dividing, separating religious from the religious from the national, at time also dividing the religious from the secular. So the recent event, and I'm getting there. So the confrontation over Al-Aqsa enabled Sheikh Ra'ed Salah to incite the Arab public that Israel not only intends to disrupt the status quo on Temple Mount, but also carry out its intention to destroy Al-Aqsa. The Muslims in Israel respond to this outcry and took to the streets. So we witness how strong and cohesive is the Islamic bond which unifies the Muslims in Israel. To conclude, some remarks, observations, and mostly questions. Number one, the reaction of the Arab public thus far is the mixed and combined result of the three processes, the three frameworks, the three prisms that I related to. One cannot detach the one from the other. They are intertwined cohesively. They nourish each other. Number two, even if the situation calms down tomorrow, which I hope it will, we can already establish that in the last couple of weeks, both the Islamic sentiment and the Palestinian identity, the components of these elements in the national identity were significantly enhanced, with the Islamic factor, in my humble view, taking the lead. Whatever eventually happens on the Israeli-Palestinian front will be directly and immediately reflected on the domestic pre-1967 scene. In October 2000, I said, if a match is being thrown on Temple Mount, Nazareth goes on fire. Well, Nazareth didn't go on fire yet, but I think the metaphor is applicable. If a third intifada erupts, it is most likely that part of the Arab public in Israel, led by the Islamic movement and Arab nationalists, will intensify its direct involvement in what may become a wave of popular resistance characteristic of the Second Intifada. If the level of violence and massive public protest increases, we are destined to see similar outcomes to those of October 2000, namely an overwhelming deterioration in Jewish-Arab relations, the Jewish side growing fear and anxiety, economic boycott, increasing alienation towards the Arabs, strengthening of the extreme Jewish right, and on the Arab side, a mirror image of that, increased sense of exclusion, alienation, marginalization, radicalization, what have you. There is therefore an urgent and immediate need to halt the acceleration of the conflict, lest we might be facing some of the consequences listed above. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to share my thanks expressed by others to the organizers of the conference, to Pam Nadell, Michael Brenner, indeed the indefatigable Laura, the indefatigable Ryan, who is somewhere about. It's a great pleasure to be here. This is a panel that seems to deal in a certain sense with the outliers, Haredim, Arabs, new Israelite communities. And I say that not mockingly or contemptuously, but because, at least in terms of Haredim and Palestinians, these two groups of people are often cast as constituting a threat to Israel as it currently stands, as at least, or the idealized version of Israel as a perfectly poised balance between Jewish and democratic. There are discussions and references to both groups as a demographic threat to Israel. And there's a literature, certainly with respect to Haredim, and I'm sure with respect to the Arab population as well, that really embodies that sense of an imminent threat that is encroaching upon an Israel that is, in a certain sense, perfectly balanced. And I think it's true it is true to a certain extent that both groups do challenge a certain image and reputation and sensibility of Israel as it understands itself in sort of the mainstream population. What I would like to do is a little bit different than the announced topic in the program, and that is simply a result of the fact that 2 weeks ago I read the charge for this conference and realized what I had thought to prepare wasn't exactly suitable. So I'd like to focus my comments more on Israel, less on the United States, and also try to offer some sense of where things might be developing in the future. And that is an act, I should say, of pure folly. I am an historian, not a prophet, but nonetheless, I will try to advance some thoughts about where things might be moving. So I'll do that in 3 ways. First, I want to introduce the subject by reference to my own area of research, which is on a Haredi community in the United States. I then want to try and trace the evolution of Haredi historical development, really from the late 19th century up to the present. And then finally, I want to do something parallel to what Eli did, using those terms, a variation of the terms he used. He used Palestinization, Israelization, and Islamization. I want to use a pair of terms to capture concurrent and seemingly contradictory impulses that we see in today's Haredi life in Israel. And that, I think, opens up the possibility for understanding where things might be heading in the future. So my point of entry to this question is not as an expert on Haredim in Israel. There's a large body of literature with very fine scholars who engaged in the study of the subject, and that's not a field that I've engaged in directly, but I have been working for the last 10 years on a study of a Satmar Hasidic community in suburban New York called Kiryas Yoel. What I want to convey about that community is it's comprised almost entirely, over 99%, of members of a particular and very insular Hasidic sect or court, the Satmar court, from the Hungarian Unterland, the northeast quadrant of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. And they adhere to a way of life that was ordained by their founding rabbi, Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, whom we'll talk about a little bit more. And yet, what is important to note is this community, which originally imagined itself as a breakaway from the Satmar Center in Williamsburg in northern Brooklyn, originally imagined itself simply as a shtetl, as a self-standing community at a remove from mainstream society. What it became over the course of the first few years of its existence was a self-standing, legally recognized municipality, a legally recognized village according to the laws of the state of New York. And that is an example, I would say, almost without precedent in Jewish history, but not without precedent, in a certain sense, in American history, which is to say that America has been receptive to strong forms of religious subcommunities almost from its inception, with perhaps the boldest example of that empowerment of religious subcommunities, the state of Utah, which is, for all intents and purposes, an extraordinary Mormon political enclave. And I make this point because it relates to an important methodological proposition that will inform me throughout, which is to say that communities such as Kiryas Yoel, while seemingly at a remove from mainstream society, are nonetheless part of the landscape of a particular society, in this case of American society, and subject to forces of acculturation that are not always visible. This is an important principle in understanding the history of Haredi Judaism in general, that notwithstanding the claims of complete and total segregation from mainstream society, there always are forces of acculturation that inform, reshape, and recalibrate elements of that community from within. This is true really from the inception of the movement that we can call Haredi Judaism. Perhaps the grand architect of Haredi Judaism was an early 19th century German-born, Hungarian-dwelling rabbi by the name of Moses Schreiber, known as the Khatam Sofer, who laid out the grand ideology of Haredi Judaism even before we had the nomenclature Haredi, when he famously inverted a biblical verse to say, Chadash asur min Torah. Innovation is forbidden as a matter of Torah. And that became the grand ideology of Haredi Judaism. There can be innovation of no kind whatsoever. And hence, Haredi Judaism, as it begins to take rise in the last quarter of the 19th century, in the Hungarian Unterland, as it's known, in northern Transylvania, sees itself as constituting opposition to modernizing innovations of all sorts. And very soon after that, it focuses in with laser-like precision on a particular element of the project of modernity, which it finds particularly offensive, namely Zionism. One of the defining features of Haredi Judaism as it takes rise in that particular region of Europe is its unrelenting opposition to Zionism. Now, what's interesting is, I would argue, Haredi Judaism absorbs from the, in a certain sense, boldness, this aspirational goals, the organizational structure of Jewish nationalism, one of its ferocious opponents. And one minor indicator of that is we begin to see in the late 19th century, shortly after Haredi Judaism as we know it takes rise, we begin to see a trickle of olim, of Haredi immigrants to Eretz Israel, to the land of Israel. Leading up to the year 1919, which is one of the most important years in our story as we trace this, this historical arc. The year 1919 is the year in which the Eda Haredis, the Eda Haredit, the Haredi community, the official community, was declared in Jerusalem in 1919. Now, why, you might ask, would there be a Haredi community taking rise in the midst of the Zionist project of settlement in the land of Israel? And it was precisely in order to serve as a counterbalance, to ward off the forces of Zionism that would alter the disposition of the Holy Land. This is, and many of the important leaders of the Haredi community then come from the very birthplace of Haredi Judaism in Hungary, the founding first rabbinic leader of the Haredi, of the Eda Haredit, Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, Hungarian, his successor, Yosef Tzvi Dushinsky, a later successor, Joel Teitelbaum, whom I mentioned, all come from the birthplace of Haredi Judaism, and all present themselves as opposition bastions, a fortress of opposition to Zionism. And yet, part of what I want to maintain, drawing back to the example of Kiryas Yol, is there's a kind of subterranean exchange of ideas and principles and values and strategies that occurs when any group of people is embedded in a particular historical context. The group that establishes the Eda Haredit we can call the radicals in the Haredi world, and I'm sorry that we don't have here Gershon Greenberg, who last year gave a really fine presentation in the conference that you organized, Michael. I read the summary in which he identifies 4 discrete groups within the Haredi world. I'm going to talk about 2. One is the radicals who established the Eda Haredit in 1919. A more moderate faction begins to take rise in 1912 with the establishment of Agudat Yisrael, the Aguda, in Katowice in Silesia. This is a group that also took rise in order to prevent the exit of traditional Jews to the new Zionist movement. So it also took rise in an attempt to stem the tide of attraction to Zionism. But from relatively early in its history, unlike the Edah Haredit, it indicated a willingness to cooperate with the Zionist movement. And this was evident already in 1933 when the Aguda agreed to take a portion of the certificates of immigration that were set aside by the British to the Jewish agency, 6.5%. More famously, it was the Aguda with whom David Ben-Gurion entered into the famous, or some would say infamous, status quo agreement of June 19th, 1947, which was intended to regulate the way in which the imminent state of Israel would act with respect to the Jewish religion and its traditionally minded Jewish population. The status quo agreement declared that the state of Israel would observe the Jewish Sabbath, would maintain dietary regulations consistent with the laws of Kashrut, would maintain matters of personal status in the hands of religious authorities. It also included provisions for autonomy for discrete strands of the educational system to take rise. It's around the same time, a little bit later, that Ben-Gurion granted the first exemptions from the draft to young males studying in yeshiva. At that time in 1948 now, it was about 400 students. The most recent figures from around 2010 point to some 60,000 students today studying yeshiva who received draft exemptions. And what that reflects is the stunning growth in the rise of the Haredi population. Estimated to be around 30,000 in 1948. Today, estimated to be about 800,000, constituting 10% or so of the Israeli population. And so we see this incredible demographic growth that reflects, I think, as well, a process that has been called by the Spanish-American sociologist Jose Casanova the deprivatization of religion or of religious groups. The assumption had been that with the rise of secularism, religion would retreat to the private sphere and stay there. Well, what we have seen, especially with respect to the Haredi population, is not just a dramatic growth, but a process of deprivatization, a growing entry over the course of that 60-plus year period into the public square in ways that are quite discomfiting to non-Haredi Jews. And so this brings me really to the third point I'd like to make, which is the way in which we can see competing forces of what we might call the Haredization of Israeli society on one hand, and the Israelization of the Haredim, and that's where I connect to Eli's terms. So where do we see the Haredization? Well, we see it, first of all, we sense it in the fear of encroachment, but it's evident in demography as well. It's not just that there's this exponential increase in the rise of the numbers of Haredim. Given the birth rate of Haredi Jews, it's likely to continue to grow exponentially at a 6% annual increase compared to 1.8% for the rest of the Israeli population. So we're talking about Haredization in demographic terms. In cultural terms as well, as part of that process of deprivatization, we see a growing entry into the public square and a growing imposition, it would seem, of Haredi cultural values. Right? We saw that in the reaction to the Gay Pride Parade, which culminated in that terrible act of violence, of murder. We see it in the attempted imposition of segregated seating on buses in certain neighborhoods in Jerusalem and elsewhere. We see it as well in the reaction of Haredim to the phenomenon of women of the wall, which some of us are familiar with. So these responses are a function of, I would say, a growing assertiveness of the Haredi population as it gains a larger market share in Israel in general, as it carves out a larger place for itself in the Israeli public and seeks, it would seem, to impose itself with greater force, with a new boldness. And the new boldness stems from a third factor in addition to the demographic and the cultural, and that is the political heft that it commands. Now, it's not linearly upward. It wanes and ebbs in response to shifting coalitions. But as a general matter, there is a greater willingness on the part of Haredim, the moderates to be sure, and increasing numbers of radicals to be part of the political process in some way or another, even if only at a local level. And as I mentioned, the local level, it's important to note that Haredim very much want to live in the presence of other Haredim, but are growing at a very fast rate, which means that their insular neighborhoods are expanding and therefore abutting and oftentimes coming into conflict with communities of non-Haredim, which only increases the sense of fear of the Haredization of Israeli society. Now, in contrast to that, there is at the same time a process that we might call the Israelization of Haredim. And there are, I don't know if I can remember, 5 or 6 forces or factors that I wanted to enumerate by way of conclusion that reflect this process and which afford one some qualified measure of optimism that this will not spell the end of Israel as we know it. The first is the same political sphere that I mentioned just before as a factor in the Haredization, here functioning as a force for Israelization, because participating in the political process means engaging in a language, a set of norms, expectations that belong really to the broader society. Politics require engagement and accommodation. You open the door to that engagement, new values enter. I can give you one example that stems not from Israel but from the community I study, Kiryas Yol, where there's extraordinary political engagement with city, state, and federal officials on a daily basis. And one person told me that as a function of that constant opening of the door to visitors from Albany and Washington, Kiryas Yol had become a two-party system. I mean, there's nothing more foreign to the ideology of the founding rabbi, Rabbi Joel Teitelbaum, than the notion of a functioning democracy within the Satmar world. But as a result of that political engagement, new language, norms from the surrounding culture come in, and that's likely to happen, and in a certain sense temper some of the arch segregationist impulses of the community. So we have a political pull in as opposed to pull out. We have strong forces of economic necessity that are altering the complexion of the Haredi community. Rising rates of employment amongst Haredi men and significantly rising rates of employment amongst Haredi women, who have often been the main breadwinners in the family, as so many of the men are off studying in yeshiva. And one very important factor that enables that significant rise is computer technology. One of the most notable phenomenons often remarked is the rise of technology colleges for women who can make use and become proficient in computers and computer technology, and yet maintain a certain degree of anonymity or insularity in their home, but nonetheless conduct business over the computer. This is complicated by a series of prohibitions on home internet use that have been declared by leading rabbinic authorities. Usually there's an escape clause if use of the internet is essential for economic sustainability, but nonetheless there are real tensions there, but I'll return to the internet in a minute. Nonetheless, economic necessity is driving more entry of Haredim into the larger public square. So I should say is a third factor, consumerism. Tamar Elor, an Israeli anthropologist, worked together with a doctoral student to study the presence of Haredim at malls in and around Jerusalem, and noticed a very significant rise in the presence of Haredim in sites of public consumption. As a result of those powerful forces of acculturation that I spoke of at the beginning, we see Haredim developing modern 21st century consumerist habits, enabled no doubt in part by the rise in the desire to move out of a state of poverty in which a large number of Haredim currently dwell, according to existing figures. So consumerism is another very important force that entails the Israelization of the Haredim. Another marker, and to a certain extent pull, is language. Linguists who have studied the Haredi community note that younger generations of Haredim, whose parents speak to them in Yiddish very often, have acquired complete fluency and may even speak to one another in modern Hebrew. So that's both a symptom and a cause, both an indicator of the extent of Israelization and an additional source of attraction in order to play the game in the larger public sphere. And then a final factor that I alluded to already is what is, by many orders of magnitude, the greatest declared source of threat in Haredi communities, certainly the ones I'm familiar with in the United States, which is the internet itself. This is the ultimate leveler of boundaries that separate segregated neighborhoods from non-segregated, that separate Torah true values from the corrupted values of secular society. And there's tremendous fear and anxiety amongst leaders in the Haredi world, at the same time that there's a recognition of the economic indispensability of the internet and a certain sense of hopelessness of fighting its extraordinary power. It's enormously seductive, it opens new worlds, and it's largely available to all. So these are some of the criteria by which we can measure the degree of Israelization of the Haredim, and where is it all going to end? Well, there's a book that was produced by two scholars. How am I doing, Pam? Okay. By two scholars, well-known scholars, Emmanuel Sivan and Kimi Kaplan, entitled Hishtalvut lo Tmiyah, Integration Without Assimilation, in a negative sense. I think what we are seeing is a pull between two countervailing forces, centrifugal and centripetal, segregating and mainstreaming, Israelization and Palestinization. One of the domains in which this is going to play out, my overall sense is that one cannot resist altogether the forces of acculturation, and that ultimately Haredim will become more and more Israeli over the next spell, and maybe and likely even more and more Zionist if we take seriously two factors that may become important in the next spell: the phenomenon of Chardalim, of Haredi religious Zionists. I forgot to mention one factor that is an additional source, which is the debate over conscription. So in 2014, a law was passed that did away with the old regime of exemptions from the draft for Haredim. Prime Minister Netanyahu tabled the implementation of it in order to cobble together a coalition. But the trend seems to me towards greater integration of Haredim into the army, not at massive rates initially, but consistently moving in that direction. And in parallel, we see the rise of the phenomenon of Haredi religious Zionism, not necessarily coming out of Mea Shearim and Bnei Brak, but nonetheless joining together with that growing public visibility of Haredim. So that's one indication of the way in which Haredim may absorb some of the ethos of Zionism that they had so decisively rejected. The other is the fact that Haredim, who are squeezed out of housing in neighborhoods within the Green Line, are increasingly finding cheap housing in the West Bank. And to the extent that the West Bank becomes even more of a source of a contention, not only between Israel and the Palestinians, but within Israel about the vision of the state, then Haredim may well become, in a certain sense, more Zionist by virtue of their settlement in the West Bank. I'm inclined to say, with some measure of exaggeration and by conclusion, that in fact, it may well be that the Haredim will be the last Zionist standing. Though, in saying that, I think it's also clear that they will place far more weight on the Jewish rather than the democratic side of the equation in imagining the state of Israel in the future. Thank you very much.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here, and like everybody else, I have great thanks to Michael Brenner and the rest of his wonderful team for this extraordinarily interesting conference. So, following a conference at the Van Leer Institute in November 2014, entitled New Ways of Joining the Jewish People, which was about the global surge of people wanting to be considered Jewish or wanting to become Jewish, an article in Haaretz by Judy Maltz entitled Number of Wannabe Jews Equals That of Recognized Jews, quoted me as saying that the estimated number of non-recognized shadow Jews worldwide may be between 13.5 million and 14 million people. This figure was then repeated in other media, including Israeli TV and elsewhere, and there was some controversy over both the figure, which was indeed the roughest of estimates, and the journalist's use of the possibly pejorative term wannabe Jews. Over the intervening months, media interest in the surge of emerging Jewish communities throughout the world has been kept alive by a flood of newspaper and scholarly articles, documentary films, and books. During the same period, within Israel, there's been an ongoing debate about which authority should be permitted to conduct conversions and turn the aspirations of some of these wannabe Jews into various kinds of realities. And just a few days ago, which gives us some kind of sense of the radically changing circumstances in the world of Jewry, Yona Metzger, the former Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel, was indicted on corruption charges, somebody that wasn't mentioned in the list that was given us earlier, some of which involved his taking bribes from wealthy Gentiles who were absolutely longing to become Jewish. And then a couple of months ago, Dvir Kahana, the Director General of Israel's Ministry of the Diaspora, created a new committee to present recommendations as to what the state of Israel should be doing with some of these groups, which it defined as groups with ties to the Jewish people, which designation would be acceptable to some of the groups and offensive to others. Some of these groups, said Kahana, want some kind of association with the Jewish people and or Israel, which raises the question of what ties the government should have with them. More recently, at the beginning of this month, a caucus meeting, which I attended, was held at the Knesset to deliberate on the analogous situation of Anosim in mainly Mexico, the United States, the Caribbean, South America, and Central America, who in some cases conceivably do derive from Sfaradim, who were forced to convert 500 years ago, and in most cases do not. So who are these emerging communities? What's the history of their association with Jews? And what do they want from the state of Israel? Emerging Jewish communities covers a wide spectrum. They include groups that claim descent from the so-called lost tribes of Israel, such as the Bnei Menashe from Manipur and Mizoram in northeastern India, who you see often enough wandering around the streets of Israel's cities, or the Bnei Ephraim of Andhra Pradesh in central India, the subject of a recent scholarly book. There are groups like the House of Israel of Ghana, the Diaspora, Josi, Gassi, Malagasy Jewish Diaspora of Madagascar, the Beit Yeshurun, the House of the Righteous of Cameroon, the Gogodala of Papua New Guinea, the Lemba of Southern Africa, and a number of communities from among the Igbo of Nigeria. Some of them of great numeric significance, who also trace their origins to some remote, less defined but ancient Israelite population, all of which groups have been the subject of fairly recent scholarly investigation. Others are converts like the Abu Yudaya of Uganda, whose warrior ancestors adopted a kind of Judaism around 100 years ago. Other smaller African groups with some form in the matter of being considered Jews include the Amazigh, Berber, the Baluba, the Bassa, the Fon, the Fulani, the Hottentot, the Maasai, the Meru, the Naka, the Shona, the Soninka, Tiv, Tutsi, Xhosa, Yibir, Yoruba, and Zulu, among very many others. Most, but not all, of the claims of this latter group are dormant, but there are quite a number of recent ones, numerically significant, which are gathering momentum. Outside of Africa, among those that can be cited as having links to ancient Israel, one can think of the Pashtun of Pakistan and Afghanistan, which are for the most part not particularly active, and the Maori of New Zealand. There are also many groups in Pacific Islands with similar claims, and in Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, of people actively claim Jewish origins. On Israeli Independence Day, for instance, in Port Moresby, which is the capital of Papua New Guinea, you see more Israeli flags than you will ever see in Tel Aviv. These groups include, as we've seen, Bnei Anosim, descendants of people claiming descent from Jews forced to convert during the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions, who in South and Central America in different forms and with different religious beliefs and practices, many of them Pentecostal Christians, number perhaps millions of adherents. So to give you an example, in Nicaragua, where I've been doing field work, there are, well, if you go back sort of 50 years ago, everybody in Nicaragua pretty much was Catholic. Now 45% are Catholic, 55% are something else, and many of the something else have Israeli flags on the back of their cars. There's some sort of Pentecostalist, but many of them, perhaps as much as half, think that they're in some way Jewish and certainly have elements of Jewish and even Israeli praxis in their daily lives. So throughout the world today, there are millions then of people who are not Jewish by conventional Jewish criteria, but who in many cases consider themselves to be such and lead what they consider to be Jewish lives and practice a number of Jewish rituals. And I think here I should be clear in one respect. Many of the aspects of Judaism and Jewishness that such people espouse belong to the realm of ideas and ideologies, and therefore it must be clear that they can be accessed by anybody who has the desire to access them. For hundreds of years, non-Jews have been fascinated by Judaism, going right back to the Middle Ages, and there have been some very interesting recent works on the subject of few numerically, but some conversions to Judaism at that time. But generally speaking, and by and large, because of the straitjacket of different sorts of religious and tradition and state legislation, their numbers remained few. Let us not forget that during the period of Byzantium, it was punishable by death for a Christian to convert to Judaism, and the same thing applied in the Islamic lands over hundreds and hundreds of years. Recent times, however, which is to say broadly since the Second World War, have seen the breakdown of social and religious barriers in many parts of the world, which has had the effect of bringing Judaism to a wider and wider audience. Powerful constructions of Judaism and Jewishness have developed into a global phenomenon, a kind of brand, manufactured in part by what may be considered imaginary ethnographies, which touches people in every corner of the globe, of every colour, of every faith, of every ideology, and with the advances in the technology of communication at a faster and faster rate. Throughout the world, there are vast numbers of people who now consider themselves in different degrees to belong to the Jewish world and who are poised, ready to join it. Apart from issues of conversion reactivity in Germany and Poland, which are pretty astonishing in their own right, the question of these emerging communities is one which the Committee of the Ministry of the Diaspora will have to grapple. Many of these groups are ambitious and dynamic with international links, and they think big. Gershom Sizomu, the current leader of Uganda's Abu Yudaya group, who's received rabbinical ordination in the United States, is engaged in outreach activities to other black Africans, and his stated aim, as pointed out by Nathan DeVere, is to make Africa Jewish. And indeed, there are scholars who believe, quite rightly in my view, that Judaism is well on the way to becoming a major African religion. I don't want to get caught up here in questions of definition and legitimacy. Measuring people's Jewishness, be it on the genetic, historical, or even the spiritual plane, must invoke categories which have got little, if any, relationship to reality. Essentialist arguments creating clear and immutable distinctions between authentic and inauthentic Jews, or genuine and spurious Judaism, don't add up from a religious study standpoint, at least in the context of the phenomenology of religious experience or practice. Neither do they necessarily add up from a genetic standpoint. My concern is simply to point out that such people exist in the world in very great numbers, and that the time has come for Israel to take stock of the situation and to respond to it in some way. In Africa particularly, Israel most certainly needs a policy with respect to such groupings, and thus far it's not had one. I've heard countless pleas over many years as I've been doing fieldwork with some of these groups in Africa and elsewhere, from members of Judaizing groups for some kind of sign from Israeli diplomatic representatives that they're aware of the existence of their African brethren whose devotion to Judaism, the Jewish people, and so on is palpable. They point out with some justice that the millions of Israelites in Africa could conceivably be of some service to the Jewish state. I'm happy, therefore, that the issue is to be considered by this new committee, even if this is long overdue. For in truth, the issue is not a new one, and I should like, very briefly, to trace something of its development over the last 70 years. As we've seen prior to the Holocaust, the Zionist movement had anticipated that European Jewry would eventually provide the bulk of immigrants for their project of building a Jewish state in Palestine. With the loss of not simply 6 million, but 8 million Jews during the Second World War, because 2 million died outside the sphere of the Holocaust, the Zionist leadership first brought in survivors from the DP camps. Then Zionist agents trawled the Arab and Muslim world and flew in hundreds of thousands of dark-skinned Jews from around the Middle East in those famous operations. But it was feared, as we've seen today, that even this influx might not be enough to create a demographically viable state. So the question was, where else could immigrants be found? The millions of American Jews wouldn't come, and the Russians at the time were stuck forever, it was thought, behind the Iron Curtain. Once the full scale of the Holocaust became known in about 1946, a group of influential and highly ranked Jews living in Palestine had anticipated the demographic problem a future Jewish state might face and made the decision that the Holocaust losses would need to be replenished. To bring this about, a number of bodies were set up, including one which was called the Aguda Leman Nitre Israel, or the Organization for the Lost Tribes of Israel. The chief players in the Aguda were Jack Feitlovich, scholar of Ethiopian languages and culture, and the so-called father of the Falashas, or the Beta Israel, Nachum Slush, the Hebrew scholar and intrepid traveler in North Africa, the Arabist Israel Ben Zev, the ecumenically minded journalist Shalom Ben Chorin, and the Labour Zionist scholar of some of the marginal groups of Judaism and the second president of the State of Israel, Yitzhak Ben Zvi. These and other individuals shared a utopian and quasi-messianic vision that went far beyond the normative Zionist goal of bringing Jews to their ancestral homeland. The Aguda decided that the time was ripe for Judaism to do what it had rarely done before, to proselytize throughout the world. Shortly before his death in 1955, Feitlovich was making plans to set off for Japan to set up a Jewish outreach center there, as he was aware of a considerable number of Japanese who were attracted to Judaism and who in many cases thought that the Japanese themselves were actually Jewish. According to the Aguda, the time was ripe for the Jewish world to incorporate different groups and tribes, mainly in Africa, but elsewhere as well, who apparently were looking for a way to join or rejoin the Jewish people. In the dark days after the war, as the extent and viciousness of the Holocaust were becoming widely known, it was perhaps to be expected that Jews would look around the world, anxiously hoping to be able to replenish the human reservoir of their people, and Africa for a while was thought to be a promising pool. What they discovered, even to them, was astonishing. It was that there were so many people already in Africa who didn't need to be converted to Judaism, but who actually thought that they were Jewish. And if they didn't think that they were Jewish, they were prepared to volunteer themselves as converts. And this, of course, must have been a source of enormous astonishment to people in the 1940s to be confronted with all of these people who were actually volunteering to be Jewish. The people were in Africa, they were to be found in the Americas, they were to be found in India and Japan and the Pacific, and mainly throughout Africa. Initially, the Aguda thought that great efforts would have to be made to convert these people, but they soon realized that they were pushing against an open door. In Africa, wrote one member of the Aguda, and it's an interesting quotation, "We shall find the good, in Africa we shall find the good and faithful tribes who will take the place of the lost of the Shoah, should we turn them away." With the challenges imposed by the absorption of millions of immigrants during the first years of the state, the dreams of the Aguda L'Nitre Israel were not immediately realized. The first major development concerned the Ethiopian Jews. In the early years of the state, the Ethiopian Jews, or the Bet Israel, were little regarded, and there were plenty of experts around, such as the late Professor Edward Ullendorf, a renowned scholar of Ethiopian languages and religion, who insisted that they had nothing to do with Judaism or Jews. And it must be said that in just about every respect he was correct, which is to say that scholarship over the last 50 or 60 years has proved without any doubt at all that the Ethiopian Jews developed a kind of religion which emerged out of medieval Christianity, and they themselves have never had any links with Jewish people elsewhere. Nonetheless, and indeed within Ethiopia there are still groups. One of them is the Kamant, which have got even more kind of similarity with Judaism than the religion of the Falasha, if one may use the term. The decision to bring them to Israel was but in the 1980s, a political decision was taken which was partly humanitarian, partly significantly romantic, and mostly demographic, and the decision was that this community should be brought to Israel. It was very largely bums on seats, and it was to a very large extent provoked by pressure groups working out of the United States and Canada, who used the sort of Holocaust terminology. There were headlines all over the place talking about black Holocaust in Ethiopia and this sort of terminology. And eventually they were successful in bringing a good deal of pressure on the Israeli government to bring in this group from Africa. The decision, of course, was to bring them to Israel was made much easier by the decision of the rabbinate to designate the Ethiopian Jews as the lost tribe of Dan, which declaration, of course, is founded on very little indeed. They certainly have nothing at all to do with the historical lost tribes. And indeed, the myth upon which this designation is based goes back essentially to a 9th century kind of fiction, which was written probably in what is now Tunis. Beyond Ethiopia, the dreams of the faithful tribes in Africa and elsewhere have developed exponentially. In the internet age, previously isolated groups in remote places claiming to be far-flung members of the Jewish people were able to make contact with similar groups elsewhere. News travels fast, of course, in the 21st century, and the internet has been the means by which extremely isolated groups throughout the world have been able to form coherent transnational communities. And the medium through which these stimuli pass is also part of the message. A new way of joining the Jewish people currently is through the modern media. At the same time as information technology was developing in the 1990s, so was the science of genetics. The internet was able to disseminate traditions, and genetics, for the first time in the history of the world, was able to interrogate them in a completely novel way. When one of the Judaizing groups in Africa, the Bantu Lemba, were discovered partly by me to have what was seen as plausibly Jewish genetic markers, a number of assumptions about the nature of Jewish ethnic authenticity were shaken. And the idea that genuine Jews could be found in the most surprising places spread like wildfire. I personally have been invited by countless numbers of aspiring Jewish groups from B'nai Ephraim Dalits or Untouchables of Andhra Pradesh, or Indian Pathans or the Shinlung in Manipur, in India, or countless groups in the Caribbean and Central America, or even Palestinians in the West Bank who think that they've got Israelite origins to collect their DNA in an attempt to help them to prove, as they believe, I have done in the case of the Lemba, with what is viewed as the most unassailable scientific proof of all that they are truly Jews. Now, unfortunately, our image has disappeared, which is a shame, because I would like you now to gaze at it. So perhaps somebody could come and make that possible. But the Gogodala story is kind of interesting. I'll tell you what happened. This is a group of people who live in western Papua New Guinea, and until the 1950s they were cannibals. And so I was lecturing at the University of Sydney on one occasion, and a telephone went, and somebody was on the line, and he said, well, I'm the spiritual leader of this tribe called the Gogodala. We believe that we're a lost tribe of Israel. I've been on the internet, and I saw that you've written a book about this Lemba group. I've read about the genetic work on the Lemba. I've read all about the Cohen modal haplotype, which they apparently have. It's all extraordinary, and I want to meet you. And so he said he was going to fly in from Papua New Guinea, and he was going to meet me in Sydney. So the next day, he comes into the lobby of the hotel where I was staying, and he's carrying a large black hat. And so I go up to him, and he puts this lovely big hat in my hands, and he said, "This is a gift." And I said, "Well, that's very kind of you, thank you very much." And he says, "Inside you will see all these hairs." And he brought 500 hairs, which he'd plucked from the head of his tribesman, and he hoped that I would be able to take these back to a lab in London and have it processed in order to prove that the that the Gogodala were Jews. So even in a remote part of Papua New Guinea, and this would have been in about 2000, 2001, there were people hoping to authenticate their claims to being Jewish using the modern science of genetics. And I think that should really wait until the question time. So the Gogodala wished to invoke genetics because other groups, and notably the Lemba and the Bnei Israel of Western India, had been able to do so with such success. Subsequently, many other groups, such as the Bnei Menashe and the Bnei Ephraim, have similarly tried to use genetics in support of their claims. The idea that Jewish authenticity has got something to do with genetics has caught on. Even the vaguest whiff of a suggestion that there may be some genetic link has been sufficient for some religious authorities to declare a group of African tribal people as Zera Israel as a result, as may indeed have happened in the case of the Bnei Menashe from Mizoram and Manipur. Given that we had, I think, a particularly fascinating talk on the Holocaust this morning, and then a very interesting discussion of intended and unintended consequences. One of the things I'd just like to leave with you is the way in which the Holocaust has had some extraordinary consequences, unintended, if you like, by the discourses generated by the Holocaust in Africa among groups like the Igbo and particularly the Tutsi, where very, very strong Judaizing movements have been created over the last 20 or 30 or 40 years, where the genocides of Biafra and the genocides of the Tutsi at the hands of the Hutu in the Central Lakes area have been viewed through the prism of the Holocaust and have aided a kind of desire to enter the Jewish world on the part of these people. And this is extraordinarily strong, particularly among the Igbo, where there simply are millions of people who think of themselves as Jewish. Now, some Israelis, and I'm just finishing now, some Israelis I've spoken to think these movements, particularly in Africa, are part of the wider migrant issue confronting Western countries. This is partly, but only partly true. So they view them in the same way, if you like, as the Arabs or the Haredim, as a kind of threat. I'm not arguing that the myriad communities throughout the world which are considered outside the fold by most Jews necessarily deserve recognition by any Jewish denomination or by the State of Israel. It's obviously not remotely possible for Israel to absorb all these groups, and in many cases, and perhaps in most cases, these emerging communities have scant knowledge of Israel and no urgent desire to go there. A limited number of them already, and more in time, may wish to make Aliyah. Orthodox conversions are being carried out among the African, Indian, South and Central American groups which are making this possible. But in any event, judging by past form, Israel may well be counted on to absorb some of the multitude even without Orthodox conversions. Israel's actual policy over many years on immigration and on the status of such groups, as shown by the attitude towards the San Nicandro community, the Russian Subotniki, the West Indian Bnei Israel, as we've seen, the Bnei Menashe, the Kaifeng Jews, the Karaites, or the Ethiopian Beta Israel, or the hundreds of thousands of Russians who are halakhically not Jewish, has been highly pragmatic, and it may well continue to be so. Successors to the Agudah, Leman Nitre Israel, and the group around President Yitzhak Ben-Zvi in the 1940s and 1950s, such as Rabbi Eliyahu Avichail, architect of the so-called Elijah Project or the right wing, very right-wing Michael Freund, founder and chairman of Shavei Israel, or American activists in Kulanu or B'chol Lashon have ensured that this is most likely to happen. And I will conclude by saying this. 70 years after the end of the Holocaust, the Jewish people finds itself in a somewhat unexpected position, which sets it apart from nations like the Cambodians, the Tutsi, or the Armenians who've suffered analogous genocides. It's as if millions of people throughout the world were announcing, you know, actually, I'm Armenian. The position is that millions of people are stepping forward, not volunteering to be Jews, but declaring that they are Jews. This unexpected position was one that was dimly perceived as a possibility by the group around Ben Zvi, but which today has grown into a global transnational movement of Judaization. A couple of days ago, Yair Lapid of Yesh Atid was speaking of the desirability of total separation between Israeli Jews and Palestinians and the need to have a separation wall twice the size of the current one. If Palestinians are ever excluded from the workforce, and now I'm answering what I thought was the call of this conference, to gaze a little bit into the future, so if Palestinians are excluded from the workforce, it's not inconceivable that policy will select wannabe Jews from the emerging economies to make up their numbers. There are millions of people potentially waiting to step up. The challenge for Israel and for the Jewish people, and specifically for the new committee set up by the Ministry of the Diaspora, is decide what to do about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have some time left for questions. So what I'd like to suggest is that, first of all, you identify yourself, and we're going to take a number of questions and then let the panelists respond collectively. So Laura has, from Muhammad, we'll start with Muhammad.
Well, good evening. Thank you very much. My challenge is to Professor Reches. I have to admit, I'm coming from Tzfat Academic College in Israel. I'm visiting a Schusterman Fellow as well at UC Irvine. And I think I'm the only Arab Israeli in this room, so I have the right to ask the first question, I guess. Here's the thing. I agree with you.
That's good.
That, oh, wait until the end. I agree with you that there is a sense of more Islamization and Palestinization among the Arab Israelis. However, in the essence, this is not true. Israeli Arabs are becoming more manifestly sympathetic with the Palestinian case. They are more aware of their rights and freedoms in terms of civil and political rights, and they express themselves publicly. As for Islamization, I don't think that the Arab minority are becoming more Muslims. However, they are more dreadful because of the extreme power of the Muslim movement in Israel, to that extent that they retreat every time they receive any threat from the Muslim community, as you mentioned correctly, the cases in Tehran. But here I would like to challenge you with the following thing. You draw a linkage between the recent events and October 2000. Following October 2000, there was a recommendation, a clear recommendation by the OR Commission, the State National Commission, which suggested that the Arab minority has been suffering from institutional discrimination in Israel for many years, and that the state must take certain steps, and there is a clear list of steps, in order to cover these flaws in the Israeli democracy. I have checked this recently, and I think that, politically speaking, the government has done nothing. Nothing, simply nothing, zero implementation of these recommendations. Could this be a reason, and I'm not justifying any terrorist attacks or violent attacks to the country, but could this be a reason that should be considered seriously by the institute, by the state as such? Thank you.
And you will get a chance to hear Muhammad tonight because he's on the evening panel. We're going to take some more questions. So are any students? Laura has the microphone. Laura, back there. Alex?
Thank you. I'm Alex Kay from Ohio State University. Professor Parfit, can you, there are Jews all over the world, some of whom have deep affiliation to the State of Israel, many of whom don't particularly care for it. It sounds like many of the groups that you've been studying or in contact with don't just identify as Jewish, but also want an affiliation with the State of Israel. I wonder if you could talk about why that might be. And do you think that there might be anything about the establishment of the State of Israel and its subsequent history that actually has had a role in causing this recent phenomenon?
Okay, thank you. Additional questions?
Hi, I'm Gil Shamir. Thank you for the presentations. Professor Shira Robinson, in her book Citizen Strangers, devoted precisely one sentence and maybe a footnote to the concept of Palestinians converting to Judaism in the years following independence. This caught my eye, but unfortunately, the book is static. There was nothing else other than that sentence. I was wondering if anyone on the panel can talk about what that was, what that is, what the impact was of the Palestinian conversion to Judaism in the years following independence. How many converted, and what it all meant. Thank you.
Thank you. Additional questions? No? One in the front, and this will be the last one, and then each panelist will have 5 minutes to respond.
I was just going to ask, no one has mentioned Arab Christians. Is that community growing or shrinking or what?
All right, thank you. Ellie, do you want to start with responding? 5 minutes?
Sure. Oh, do you want me over there?
Ah. Your image finally came up too.
You can start anew. I mean,
Ellie.
well, unfortunately, I have no Google Dollars on my side. As exciting as it is, but I don't want to. I think you have an answer to the conversion. I'll contribute my own knowledge. What I know is that Ben Gurion, who was a farsighted, I mean, he foresaw what eventually would happen within 60, 70 years with regard to having an Arab minority in a Jewish state. So he called the chief rabbis. And I don't know whether Shira speaks about that in her book. And he consulted with them with regard to the possibility to convert the Arab community in Israel. You know, some of you might smile, but in principle, it's not a bad idea, because then there wouldn't be the question of Arabs or Muslim, Christian, Jewish state. Well, the two chief rabbis quickly explained that this is undoable, and this was the end of it. Arab Christians, let's say a word about them. They constitute presently 8% of the non-Jewish population in Israel. Now, the interesting thing is that in the 50s, the share of Arab Christians within the population was 24%. So it dwindled down to 8%. So what happened? Where are they gone? I can tell you that it is not immigration. Hardly any Christian Arabs. I'm not saying that there aren't any who leave, but unlike the West Bank, for example, in the last 2 decades, where big numbers of Christians have left, this is not the case in Israel. The reason is very simple: demographics. The rate of growth of the Christian community is, I think, even less than that of the Jews, and for sure less than that of the Arabs and the Druze community. Hence the difference. There is a lot to be said about the Arab Christian community, but I don't think that I have the time to do that. As to my friend Muhammad Watad. So you raise a good question. How do we establish whether a society undergoes a process of Islamization? Because, you know, I may say one thing and you may say the other. You might be more knowledgeable, you live within this society, you can feel, you have sense of. The answer is very simple. I think that you need a set of criteria, clear criteria to establish a trend like Islamization. You can judge it by polls, for example. I personally am not a big fan of polls conducted within the Arab society in Israel, particularly on sensitive issues such as national identity. But others think differently, and I think that those polls done by Asad Ghanim and Sami Smuha definitely indicate a much bigger affinity to religion gradually increasing over the years. But then you can look at what happens on the campuses, for example, the way female students are being dressed. You can check mosque attendance. You can check the number of mosques which has been doubled or duplicated God knows how many times in the last 2 decades. You can look at consumption of religious literature, etc., etc., etc. So, you know, in order to decide in a decisive way, you indeed need to apply all these criteria. Vadat Or, the Or Commission. I fully agree with you. And remember, my first cycle was Israelization, and I did begin with showing some advancement, but the bottom line, you're right. I mean, perhaps 1/16 of what was recommended in the Or Commission has been implemented. I mentioned land, and this was one of allocation of land for public purposes. This was one of the most important recommendations. With, you know, the immediate thing that goes through my mind, I hope there will not be a Vadat Or number 2. But this dissatisfaction, feeling of discrimination within the younger generation, I think the emphasis this time, and God forbid that there will be a second October 2000, the younger generation plays a much more prominent role, and it is in response to this disenchantment with what the with this denial process. Even though Ron Gerlich thinks it's an end of the denial, no, I think that the denial is still there. Israeli governments for years, the policy that they had adopted was, you know, just ostrich policy. They put their hair in the sand. They swiped the issue under the carpet. They still do that.
Tudor?
Yes, the question as to why it is that many of these communities love Israel, whereas many Jews throughout the world don't have much interest, and whether this is connected in any way with the beginning of Zionism. Well, I think it is connected with the beginning of Zionism. First of all, I'd like to say a word about that. If you think about British policy during the First World War, there's a very, very clear parallel to be drawn between the policy with respect to Palestine and the Jews and the policy with respect to Christians and Anatolia. And in both cases, British policy was determined and dictated by great affection for classical paradigms. The people concerned were all classicists, and British society was raised on an unrelenting diet of classical literature and so on. And in a way, the same thing happens throughout the empire. Wherever the British went, and it's not unique of British imperialism or colonialism, it was true of other kinds of colonialism as well, Jewish communities of different sorts would be constructed as a innate process of colonization. So in the case of the Americas, the standard interpretation over hundreds of years of the indigenous population was that they were of Israelite origin, lost tribes of Israel, and the same thing was true everywhere else that the British colonist went, unless there was some extremely well-rooted local historical narrative which clearly argued the opposite. So in the case of India with its written traditions and its religious texts, or China, it wasn't entirely possible to come up with this, but in many other places, particularly the Pacific, African countries with no written tradition, the Americas and so on, it was. And these kind of constructed movements in just about every case were linked with Christianity, of course. All of the current groups have grown out of Christianity. And so what Jerusalem and what the Jewish people mean for these groups, let's say in Papua New Guinea, it means something to do with the Bible. It means something to do with redemption. It means something to do with liberty. It means something to do with freedom. And hence the affection for the State of Israel. Of course, you will be swift to point out, I'm sure, that, well, many of these people are poor and they're probably longing to plug into the wealth of the Israeli state. The truth is they really don't know very much about the Israeli state. The main thing is kind of messianic. They have a messianic love for the State of Israel. The Palestinians who want to be Jewish, and that was my second question, this is a discourse which goes way back to the 19th century. There were lots of intrepid Jewish travelers and writers writing in Hebrew about habits and customs of the Bedouin groups in what is now the West Bank. And Ben Tzvi similarly took these up, and this was a big deal for Ben Tzvi, these Bedouin groups. And more recently, one of the first of the Israeli exits who'd made a fortune in high-tech business decided to devote his fortune to encouraging the Palestinians in the territories who felt that they had Jewish origins to come out and be counted. And I spent a couple of fairly scary days going around the territories and meeting some of these people in remote valleys and hilltops, and it was a very fascinating. I don't think there is any particular justification for any of this in purely historical terms, but one of the things that time and time again, and particularly in the Caribbean and South America and so on, sort of speaking with the huge new conversos kind of groups, is that you say, well, why do you think you're Jewish? What is the thing? What's the business? Explain it to me. And they always say the same thing, and they use the same gesture. They put their hand on the stomach and they say, it's something I've always felt down here. And this is what the Palestinians say.
Yeah.